Good afternoon or good morning. It depends when you watch us, of course, to this second session of the Q&A session for the MOOC Discover Political Science. I'm here with Stefano Camatari, and we're very happy to be here discussing a few questions that have been posted on the forums. And maybe let's go directly to the first question, which was raised by John Jacob 200. It was initially written in French, but we're going to translate for you. This question is very simply, is there something in between an ideology, a political ideology between socialism and conservatism? Another learner, W. Dake Ice, kindly answered this question or started to answer this question, saying that, okay, you should look at liberals, for instance, seems to fit in between, but we should also note that it's important to see that the left-right cleavage, it's not only a continuum, but it's, you could say, a different axis to some extent. So, Stefano, could you discuss this a little bit?
Yes, of course. This is a very interesting question, and it makes us particularly understand that the way we depict, we create description of political parties and of their profile, their ideological characteristics can change over time. And of course, we can have parties possibly staying anywhere on a political spectrum, and we can characterize a political spectrum as having many different forms. Of course, the traditional one is an unidimensional form, which goes traditionally from left to right, with left meaning, let's say, social openness and social and economic progressism, let's say, characterizing political forces leaning toward, let's say, redistribution, toward the poorest elements and sectors of society, and on the other hand, let's say, rightist parties and conservatism, so conservation of traditional and already existing social orders or economic distribution of the goods in a society. And of course, between these two strange, very important elements, very strong and important element, what can we put? This is the question of our learner. That, of course, there should be an equilibrium between these two different views, because many people, and this is also a result of many empirical studies about party competition and about electoral behavior and political attitudes, is that there are many people who feel really in the middle between these two labels, between these two elements. So how can we characterize? Is there a sort of political balance between the two? Are there people that are between these two different ways of characterizing contrasts in a political society? Yes, of course. We can call it political equilibrium, political balance, and to some extent this centrist, because of course it characterizes these people or these parties as staying exactly in the center between these two different points, which are at the extreme, positions of the traditional axis of competition, as being moderate, let's say, or indifferent between the two extremes. So, as you have seen in the MOOC in week 4 about ideologies, the Christian democratic family, let's say, is one of the clear examples of something of a sort of political enterprise during a long history, trying to identify itself in a sort of moderate package of policies and of political proposals that have been offered to the people, especially after World War II and until today, let's say, because we still have all the elements that compose a sort of democratic Christian party family across all Europe. But of course, this is only one solution. You can have this kind of centrist actors on the one side, you can have elements on the left, elements on the right, and this is not the only way to characterize political competition, because much more issues, not only related to, for example, economic conflict or values that can be synthesized by being on the left or being on the right, whatever they mean, because their meaning changes over time, we can have also other domains of political competition that open up new perspectives on new possible dimensions of political competition, which could be, for example, orthogonal to this traditional left-right axis. So we can think, for example, about the case of populism, which opens, for example, a sort of new way of categorizing political actors, which is not based on this sort of horizontal categorization, which opposes left with right, but in a sort of vertical uh, categorization, which opposes, for example, parties that argue to stay on the side of the right of the good people against the corrupted elites, for example, which comprehends both parties or a political elites, politician on the left and on the right side of the traditional political spectrum. But of course, it's not only about that. We can have many different elements that compose a second, let's say, dimension of political competition. Just think about being pro or anti the EU unification process. This is specific of European party systems. Of course, we can experience what we call Eurosceptic parties. Are they on the left? Are they on the right? Sometimes they are on both parts of the traditional political spectrum. And in addition to this, they add another element, which is clearly their sort of Eurosceptic stance, which is orthogonal, which is valid for both, let's say, sides of the political spectrum where they decide to strategically stand for a specific moment in time. And of course, this is something that can be a fixed characteristic of their political profile. This is something that can change over time. So, political centrism or moderatism, let's say, is something that characterizes a party that, if we think about traditional left right opposition, is something that can be located exactly in the center. So, either in religious way, let's say in a Christian democratic way, or in a neutral or laicistic way, can interpret this sort of balance between the two different options or extreme boundaries of a political competition in a traditional way. But of course, in addition to this, we can think also about a second, a third, or a fourth dimension. Most of the time is a second dimension because Ed Schatzscheider, which is one of the most important political theorists and political scientists of the 20th century, one of the tasks of politics is to make the matter of political competition as simple as possible. So most of the time we have the possibility to characterize political competition as structure along a single dimension. Sometimes it's two. Three, most of the time, would be too much. So politicians tend to simplify our environment, and the same is requested by the people because they need to decide in an easy way. And so think about it, please. It's about one dimension and sometimes about a two-dimensional competition that our political environments are most of the time composed by.
Yeah, and some political observers said today the main underlying cleavage is actually openness versus closeness of society. And let's take, for instance, the issue of immigration, for instance, or migration. Some will say, okay, our society should be pretty open. Others will say, no, I mean, we should actually restrict the access to some criteria to our society. The same goes for some values, for instance, in terms of religion. To what extent the society accept new values, new religion in it? Or others would say, no, we should limit. I mean, coming to our society means not necessarily embracing this religion particularly, but actually limiting the appearance, the public appearance of one other religion. So this is also, for some observer, a new cleavage. And it brings us to the United States, for instance, where if you take the President Obama and President Trump on the stance of immigration, that very different politics. And not maybe because one was a Democrat and the other one was a Republican, but maybe because of the vision of society or what the United States should be. This topic brings us to the second question, which was asked by Louv3x. And this learner asks us, what is exactly the American institution between, in particular, the Senate and the American Congress? It looks like they're two parts of the same parliament, but Stefano, I'm sure you will tell us a bit more about this.
Yeah, sure, with great pleasure. The question by Louv3x is about the United States and their authorities, and the question is precisely as Min was saying, what is exactly the Senate and what is the American Congress? What are these two bodies that characterize the American political environment? They look to be part of the same parliament. So actually here we have to be careful because as Min was anticipating, we have in the United States a specific composition of of political institutions. So we have the Senate on the one side, we have the House of Representatives, and the first of them is generally called the upper chamber, and the House of Representatives is the lower chamber. And both of them create altogether what is normally recognized as the US Parliament. So we have two well-distinct bodies. Each of them has its own competencies, its own role in a society, its own areas in which they have to rule the society. And then, apart from them, you have the president, that of course has his own prerogatives. And as you know, from week 3, they are all part of the same presidential political system, where the president is a very strong figure and has, let's say, its own autonomous life vis-a-vis the parliament, composed by the House of Representatives and the Senate, so that no one of them, nor the parliament on the one side, and neither the parliament on the one side and nor the president on the other one, can take complete control on each other. Of course, there is interaction between them. Sometimes some acts of the president of the United States are ratified by the Senate, for example, but let's say these two institutions and their internal differences, like House of Representatives and Senate on the side of the US Parliament, have their own autonomous life. Just think about it. Today, we are having the midterm elections in the US. So this is just to say that this is something very specific of the American Parliament. This is not something that relates to the presidency. So the Parliament autonomy renovates along and over a certain amount of time. So we have 2 years standing for the House of Representatives, people composing the House of Representatives, and we have 6 years for the senators while they are in charge and with a complete possibility to take advantage of their functions in the American Parliament. On the other hand, we have the American, let's say, presidential elections every 4 years, and let's say that each of these elements then is elected and has his own elections and political competition in which people is involved in trying to make a choice between different candidates in districts or at the global level within their states for the president, in another sense, every specific amount of time. So this is something that makes us recognize the specificity of a presidential system where parliament on the one side and the president have their own life and never really interact with each other. But of course, there are also other cases, because other democratic regimes can be structured in different ways, as you have also experienced during week 3. So we have the parliamentary regimes, which are clearly different in their basic philosophy and in their, let's say, basic rationale compared to a presidential system, as the parliament is the real center of gravity of the political action of the political system. So we have a parliament having a complete control over the government, in the sense that they can grant the government the formal authorization to govern, let's say, by means of confidence or non-confidence votes. So there is a sort of primacy of the parliament. In semi-presidential system, which are, let's say, in the middle between the presidential one, which is the one that is described by our learner, and the parliamentary system, then we have this sort of semi-presidential system that is the case of France, for example, where there are more interactions between the parliament on the one hand and the head of the state and his own government on the other one, in the sense that the parliament has the control to remove the ministers and to take off the confidence to government created by the president. But on the other hand, the head of the state has not a control directly on the government, so only the parliament can actually grant this government the authorization or not to proceed with its own tasks in the society. But on the other hand, the head of a state can always call for new elections, so basically indirectly taking away the power from the parliament, and so having a new political competition in the game within a few months, let's say. So these are the different elements, let's say, the 3 different categorization of democratic system related to the characteristics and relationships between what the parliament does, and what the government, and what the head of the state does, and their relationship among them. And just to be clear, the question by our user, by our learner today, refers specifically to the case of the American elections. I don't know if Mins wants.
Yeah, and in line to what you said, is what is actually very interesting is that in the presidential system in the United States, for instance, as the election of today, it could be the case that the majority in each of the chamber and maybe of the Congress might be different than the party of the president, which would not be the case in the parliamentary regime, where the prime minister or the chancellor has to be backed by a majority of the parliamentarians. Which see, I mean, we will see clearly the difference, of course, if this is the case. Maybe it won't be the case. What is also interesting, and maybe that's the link between the two questions of the day, is that when we look at the political situation in the United States in particular and the political situation in Europe, we see that somebody who is called a liberal in the US is differently categorized in Europe. Could you explain this? Because on the one hand, in the US, a liberal is somebody on the left. In Europe, it's rather somebody on the right.
Well, yes, this is something very interesting, and of course, this really shows you how the meaning and the labels that we use in political science and to describe party and political competition in general can really change according to the context and according to the developing of time, let's say. So basically, this is what in political science we should call a sort of path dependency, in the sense that political events at a certain time, influence our let's say the way we used to describe politics, or the way we used to act in political terms. So yes, actually, in the U.S. we have this description of the liberals that, according to the way society developed in the U.S., is something more leaning toward the left side. Also because, let's say, that the communist and the socialist tradition was absent in the U.S., but also the way of running politics and party competition was very different from the European style, let's say. So parties really had a less important role, let's say, less important weight in the society. Candidates and their relationship with their districts were much more a key factor of U.S. political competition, since from the very ancient time of the U.S. as a federation. So in the end, this results in the creation, the birth of this competition scheme, which has liberals on the one hand, as a, let's say, a leftist side of the American politics, and conservatives on the other hand. So in Europe, things have been developing in a different way. So we have, of course, the birth of communism, which changes a lot the development of history, and we have the development of socialist parties with all the different shades, let's say, structuring the reforms between the 19th and the 20th century, both in economic and in political terms, in terms of the creation of what we call also in week 2 the welfare state. And here, of course, the meaning of what is left already after the French Revolution, but even later, of course, you will find all this in the MOOC, creates a different meaning of this opposition between what is actually the left and what is actually the right. So it's not that left and right as the basic opposition and as the basic dimension of political competition as a stable, as a fixed meaning, let's say, over time and across different countries, across different contexts and different histories of this context. But of course, they can change, and they change according to history, according to events that, of course, can make country, the political system, lean toward one direction or the other of development of it's their same political system and their same way of running a political competition, I would say.
Yeah, thank you, Stefan. Very useful remarks. I don't see any more questions popping up. Maybe there will be more, and we, of course, invite you to ask more questions, and do not hesitate to use the forums. They're there for you to be used. Maybe as a concluding question, let's discuss a bit about this important question. I mean, you might have followed this big issue of a Saudi Arabian journalist maybe being murdered by his own political regime because he was an opponent. This is not the debate I want to touch in, but behind this there is a debate of should democracies, and we've heard from, for instance, that Germany is not willing anymore to do trade with, or on some issue with Saudi Arabia, which is not the case of the United States, for instance.
Yeah.
So should democracies, and it links week 3 and week 4 of the course, should democracies trade with non-democracy or with political regime that are seen by some as non-democratic?
Well, this is a very, very important, a very relevant question, which shows you, first of all, how studying politics first, is important. And it affects our lives, and it affects our ways of creating our own opinions and of standing toward specific political facts that we experience every day and every day. So this is a terrible political fact, and of course, from a political science perspective, I would say you can frame, you can define your answer in many different ways. I would refer, for example, to the different theories of international relations that were defined in the MOOC. Of course, there you can find, and even before, if you look at the thought of the pioneers of political science, you can find some different types of answers. And of course, everything about your answer will depend about your basic conception of how politics works in the world. So it's about basic, let's say, philosophical statements about how the world works, and about you should adapt to this world according to how reality actually is. So if you have as your starting point the idea that this is how things, although badly, work, and that if you are going to stop your trading activities with Saudi Arabia, then someone else will do it instead of you, and then you're going to lose your, let's say, competition advantage in the economic competition in the global perspective, then you will probably very realistically, because this is something that especially pertains to the realist paradigm of international relations, then you will not give up trading with these people because this is going to damage your the same population of your country that you are governing in a way or the other. So if you are this kind of starting point, then you would have a sort of very, very concrete, and I mean, it can be shared or not as a political view, but this is one of the possible approaches. On the other hand, you have more normatively related perspectives on political facts, political events, and then you could also think that, yes, this is human nature, maybe, or not, because, of course, this is something that relates to the use of power, but not only in a legal sense. It is a way of using power which is basically a threat to the people, to the population. But then we can have some boundaries to this kind of dynamic. So we can have, for example, institutions, we can have NGOs, not governmental organizations, we can have many other devices to stop these tendencies that the world and the political actors sometimes have. So we can be a bit more optimistic. And then I can believe in my own strategy to stop my trades with this country, also as a signal to the entire political community in the world, because my basic expectation is that all the other people watching me doing this could be affected by my actions, so they could follow me in a way or the other. So basically the choice between the two, because this is a real paradox of international relations and of political behavior at the elites level, let's say, I would say that behind this choice there are different visions of society and of the consequences of your actions. So in the end, I would leave the final decision to our learners, and just keep in mind that there are different, very, very different starting points, very different perspectives from which you can frame these kind of facts and how you would deal with these facts or with their consequences. So nothing is simple. Politics, as we said from the beginning in the MOOC, is almost or always everywhere. So we have to develop a political attitude which is fit also sometimes, unfortunately, to deal with these very, very serious and very, very bad threats and situations.
And at the core of this, there is the notion of power. and
Exactly.
keep posted, because of course this is the final week of the MOOC Discover Political Science. But for now, Stefano, we can actually say that we will see each other again on 5th of November, so in 2 weeks from now, for another Q&A session, the last Q&A session. We would like to wish you a pleasant journey through the MOOC, and this is it for now. Bye-bye.
Goodbye.